Happy Friday mga katribo and welcome to another episode of Kalingang KaTribu Legal Diaries. I am Roy Pelovello and today we are fortunate to be joined by Aranas Cruz, Araneta Parker, and Faustino Law Offices Associate, none other than lawyer Attorney Alfred Campañano. Good afternoon, Attorney. Good afternoon, Attorney. Our topic for today is basic human rights at pag human rights ang usapan, tingin ng marami, madali lang ito intindihin. But there seems to be a lot of misconceptions or misunderstanding. Minsan, we think our rights are being violated, pero in truth, hindi naman pala. A lot of people think that being inconvenienced means there's already a violation of human rights. That's why Attorney Alfred, we are fortunate that Attorney Alfred is here today to clarify some of our questions. So before we start, good afternoon, Attorney. Attorney, we're just trying to address our technical problem, but our topic for today is human rights. It's very interesting because there's a lot of issues being floated now. We have heard that the Department of Justice have decided to file some charges against law enforcers charged with alleged violation of human rights. So again, good afternoon, Attorney.
Yan. Hello, good afternoon. Sorry. Nagkaroon lang ng technical issue.
Yes, we did.
So,
Pag umuulan, sometimes we do have these kinds of technical issues.
so where were we?
I was telling our katribo that our topic for today is human rights kasi ang daming mga isyong lumulutang in connection with human rights. Pero before we start, bumati ka muna sa ating mga katribo.
Oo nga pala, good afternoon.
Ayan. Ngayon, siguro, for starters, ano ba yung, mas maganda, we clarify what is human rights. Ano ba yung definition ng human rights?
Under the, as stated in the, as stated in the UN website, and your Universal Declaration of Human Rights website, human rights are basically your rights. So these are rights of an individual that's inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. So this is a right that is, this is a right that is given to human beings because they are humans, nothing more, nothing less, and it's free from discrimination, or it is free from any sort of bigotry or prejudices.
Ayan. So, with that kind of definition, can you tell us other attributes or characteristics of what we call human rights?
So, pag characteristics or the attributes of human rights, I can actually identify around 4. First is it's universal.
Mm-hmm.
Second is inalienable. It's indivisible. That's 3rd. Equality and non-discrimination, that's 4.
Okay.
So for first starters is when you say it's universal, it is universal because this right exists without borders. So whether you're in whether you're in the continent of Africa or in the Americas or in Europe, diba, that right as a rule is recognized and should be protected. So it's basically it's a rights without borders, no?
Yan. That kind of right is recognized by law, unlike other rights katulad ng ating mga statutes that are confined ang applicability to our national borders.
Correct. So that's the first attribute, no, the universality of human rights. The second attribute is inalienable. The idea here is these rights cannot be taken away. So yan yung idea dyan of inalienability of human rights. So please note lang that there are instances wherein these rights may be regulated, but they're not necessarily taken away. Diba? So parang dyan papasok yung, for example, in some countries, death penalty is allowed because under their policy, or they are under the state's policy, then there are instances where life is are can be taken away because if you committed a certain offense, for example. So that is the idea there. No? So it can be regulated, certain, but it cannot be, supposedly it cannot be taken away arbitrarily. So that's the second element or attribute of human rights. The third attribute is indivisibility or interdependent. Actually, some textbooks would separate this interdependence and interrelated, interdependence and interrelated. I don't know though, however, kung ano yung pagkakaiba niya in that sense. But the idea of this fourth attribute is they are enjoyed as a cluster. So hindi siya basta-basta, so hindi siya ma-enjoy ng isang tao if one aspect of human right is let's say it's not also enjoyed. So I think a good example of this is yung freedom of movement. The freedom of movement, or basically yung pag-alis mo from one place to another, that is a freedom that's supposedly a basic human rights. But if at the same time the right to a decent and adequate standard of living is deprived, then hindi mo naman na-enjoy talaga yung freedom of movement.
Mm-hmm.
So parang ganun yung idea niya, na para the view here is the human rights as a group, no, should be given holistically. Kasi if one is not well protected, then obviously nagkakascade yan to the other rights. So it's really indivisible. But at the same time, they are interdependent because in that respect, certain human rights are an offshoot, no, of another human right. So a good example again is stemming from the freedom of peaceful assembly. So this is supposedly a basic human right under the Civil and Political Rights International Covenant. So in that sense, that freedom of assembly cannot be enjoyed, no, if the basic right of the freedom of expression and opinion, for example, is also not protected. Because normally, di ba, you collect yourself, you group yourselves together if you have a shared belief system or if you have a shared opinion on a certain issues. So, yan yung sinasabi natin na interdependent sila to each other. So, the idea here is they're indivisible and interdependent because you cannot completely enjoy the benefits of one specific human right if other basic human rights are not well protected or are not being enjoyed by the citizen. And lastly is equality and non-discrimination. Basic human rights, as a rule, is inherent to everyone just because you are a human being. So this is regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or on whatever kind of standard that that the state or any person would wish to use. So hindi ibig sabihin na dahil maputi ka, you're brown, you're yellow, you're green, I don't know. Diba then, kahit anong kulay mo ng balat mo pa, supposedly, you are supposed to enjoy this because you are all human beings. So yan yung idea ng human rights.
Wow, ang laki pala ng scope ng idea ng human rights. And you're saying that every person has to be accorded all these rights, no matter your creed, your color, your beliefs, your political stand. Pero applicable ba ito dun sa ano? When the application of this start, applicable na ba ito dun sa mga, how about yung fetus sa womb ng mother? Applicable na ba ito, and does that right extend to the mother? Halimbawa, yung fetus pa lang yan.
That is a touchy subject to touch, no, Sir Roy. But okay, in our state or in the Philippines at least, we know that abortion is illegal, no? Because for us, I think the concept of life begins at conception. I think this is rooted in our, I think, strong religious foundation. Religious kasi I suppose shared naman ang position dyan whether you're Islam or Christian. So strongly rooted siya sa uh, religious foundation ng ating bansa. But under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international covenants for promoting or protecting human rights in general, then the human rights aspect begins at birth.
Oho.
So the answer is simply no. No,
Okay.
it's not. Human rights in itself does not begin at conception or yung parang fetus pa. That it's human rights is because you are. The idea here in international standard is you are human when you are born. When there is a complete severance already of the baby from the mother. So during the time, during that period rather, na the fetus still inside the womb, the mother, internationally at least, is seen as an individual. So sa kanya naka-extend ang human rights. Na as to whether he wants, so doon papasok yung offshoot dyan na would this mother, for example, would the woman, for example, who is pregnant, would she go to carrying this child to term or will she terminate it? This is also an aspect of human rights na kung saan her body autonomy and her decision as a woman is also protected. So I kind of understand why in that sense, human rights is couched in that way because, again, this should also accommodate yung other states that may have a different position on when life or when life begins and consequently when a fetus is considered as a human being.
Ayun, mukhang medyo tricky nga dahil apparently some states, some jurisdictions, I should say, allow the abortion. Dito sa atin, hindi po pwede yon. So apparently, mayroong variance yung pagkaintindi doon sa application ng right na yan. Pero there should be an equal understanding kung ano yung internationally agreed scope ng protection ng human rights. So maybe the next question is, where do this come from? What are the sources of international human rights law?
The sources of international human rights law. Let's see. So when you talk about international human rights law, basically it speaks of the provision obligations laid down for governments to what are the ways that they should conduct themselves. Now, we're talking about government, not the country. We're talking about the government here. And later on, I'll discuss why I'm giving emphasis to this. So international human rights law lays down the obligation of government on how to act in certain ways or how to refrain from doing certain acts in order to promote and protect human rights and the fundamental freedoms of individuals or group. So in that sense, your sources of international human rights is also known as your International Bill of Human Rights. And in this case, is composed of three covenants or three treaties. First is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is adopted sometime in 1947 and 46, I think. And the other one is the second one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But I think unahin ko muna yon. I think it's better na unahin natin yung third one, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Because ang nangyari kasi the UDHR muna, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then sumunod yung International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the third one is your International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. What I want to emphasize here at this short period of time na dinidiscuss natin is, kaya I am very particular in that order because makikita naman natin in the flow of history is nagsa-start muna tayo with recognizing what are the basic dignities that should be afforded any human being. Kahit saang bansa ka pa dyan mag-start. Tapos ang mangyayari dyan is, if you're gonna look at history, you recognize who you human beings are, what are the basic things and rights that they should be given. Kasi ang mangyayari niyan is that in certain countries or makikita mo dyan na in that recognition may mga madi-disenfranchise. So they will be demanding civil and political rights. So for example, back then, the right to vote is not extended to women.
Yes, yes.
So sila yung, but there is a recognition that that public participation, and in this case election for example, is a fundamental human right because that is a right given to people in determining what their governments will be. But again, mayroong na disenfranchised na group, which is in this case women. So ang nangyari dyan, these women or yung mga strong women at that time grouped themselves together and then they demanded civil and political rights. In this case, the right to suffrage, which is of course good enough. That's being practiced mostly in the world. And then nung nag-settle na tayo na okay, these women now have a say on has a say on how to run government, has a say who should lead the government. Then makikita natin yung interest ng women will now be promoted in government, which leads us to the third international covenant, which is economic, social, and cultural rights. So makikita natin dyan na when we were able to introduce and allow women to be legislators, for example, or to be presidents, then we can see that the certain interests of women were already codified. So for example, yung mga maternity leave mo in the workforce or yung equal pay, di ba? So in that sense, nakikita natin that it usually starts off from the recognition of what right it is. So that's your Universal Declaration of Human Rights in this case. And then second is, for those people who are being deprived of these rights, they will seek their right to participation, which is basically your civil and political rights. And then when you have given them their civil and political rights, then they will obviously protect and promote their economic, social, and cultural rights. So you view it that way in the perspective of history.
Ayun. So, dyan pala nagsimula yung pagkilala sa iba't ibang klase ng human rights. Pero nabanggit mo kasi may treaty ito. So, for government or state to recognize and accord these rights to the people, kailan ba signatory sila dun sa treaty na yun?
Actually, the general rule here is you should be a signatory to a treaty, di ba? Because remember, states are like individuals, and treaties at a certain at one angle is viewed like a contract at an international level. That's why, for example, nakikita mo dyan yung sa West Philippine Sea dispute, makikita natin dyan that China is not recognizing jurisdiction because apparently they're not signatories to a specific treaty or they do not consent to that jurisdiction. However, remember that under the attribute of inalienability and the universality of human rights, the theory goes is that even if you are not a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or any of this international Bill of Human Rights that I have discussed a while ago, these are inherent to a person. So the state need not sign treaties in order to be obligated to protect these human rights and promote them in their respective countries.
Ayun, malinaw. Ayan mga katribo, so I think we're getting a clearer picture of the nature and scope and attributes of human rights. At marami pa tayong malalaman when Legal Diaries return. We'll be back.
Magandang araw mga katribo! Narito na ang mga mga makakasama nyo tuwing umaga sa programang Gising Na. Roy Pelovello, Atty. Lia Badillo Crisostomo, Vernon Velasco, Kim Sancha at Chirk Balagtas. Abangan ang programang Gising Na sa Facebook page ng Daily Tribune.
Ilabas na ang mainit na kape at samahan kami sa inyong pag-almusal, mga katribo.
Simulan natin ang bawat umaga with good vibes sa mga informative and recreational segments ng aming programa.
Maaari niyo rin ibahagi sa amin ang inyong opinion via Daily Tribune Facebook page at Tribune Now sa YouTube.
Makichika na rin sa latest showbiz happenings, mga katribo.
Kaya naman, pagsama-sama po tayo sa
Gising Na!
Ang Daily Tribune may digital shows na din. Dahil sa mas lumalaki at mas lumalakas nating tribu, handog sa inyo ng Daily Tribune ang mga programang magbibigay buhay araw-araw. Be informed at mag-good vibes tuwing umaga sa programang Gising Na. Be updated sa news and happenings sa Tribune News on Cue. Mas kilalanin pa natin ang mga paborito nyong atleta sa programang The Athletes Tribune. Alamin ang latest entertainment sa programang What's Up. Ma-inspire sa mga kwentong hatid ng Perfect. Search lang ang Daily Tribune sa inyong Facebook at Tribune Now on YouTube. See you there, mga...
Welcome back to Kalingang KaTribu Legal Diaries, and we're still with Atty. Alfred talking about our basic human rights. Atty. Alfred, we've read something about the concept of generations of human rights. Ano ba to? What's that and what does it mean?
Actually, the generations of human rights talks about the evolution of human rights as we know of today. So again, yung mahaba ko example kanina, that's actually that's my attempt to to illustrate these generations as well. Because the first generation, or yung liberté na tinatawag, I think it's French kasi may ganun sa ano.
Liberté.
No, may kulot sa taas.
Medyo mga pang French tayo dyan. Ang alam mo natin, French fries at saka French bread. Pero the concept, of course, the concept of liberty, democracy, and equality came from the French.
Yes, supposedly. So, liberté, that's the first generation of human rights. Again, this more focuses on civil and political rights. So, ano yung mga na ini-imagine natin at that time? The first generation of human rights is talks about individual liberties. So dito, mayroong subcategories tayo dyan, which is physical security and civil empowerment. Physical security, because we all know that that as an individual, we are actually weak, no? In terms of, say, with respect to the government itself. For example, without any rule of law, without any law prohibiting it, if the government wants to shoot me now through my window in the office, they can do so. Diba? Because they have the machineries and resources to do that. If I am walking through Salcedo and they want to take me somewhere, they can do that. But because as opposed to government, I don't have the machineries, or I'm actually a tiny person, as opposed to a collective. So the first subcategory of liberté is your physical security. So so that protection is you're supposed to enjoy your movement. Naglalakad ka dyan in the streets, you should not be fearing that government will take you away. If you are convicted of a crime, then penalties should be handed out with tawag ito, yung calibrated dapat ang punishment mo.
Meaning commensurate to the offense.
Commensurate, that's the proper term. It should be commensurate to the offense. So dito yung mga freedom from torture. Hindi ibig sabihin na nagnakaw lang ako ng iPhone, for example, wino-waterboard na ako. Para ganyan. Or di ba?
Ito ba yung kasama doon sa ating constitution na freedom against, prohibition against excessive and inhuman punishment?
Inhumane punishment. That's correct. So, yun yung tawag, that's an example of the first subcategory of liberté, which is your physical security. The second subcategory of liberté is your civil empowerments. Dito na papasok yung participation nyo to dictate or to to participate in public affairs. Remember,
ito yung nabanggit mo kanina, the right to suffrage,
the
particularly
right to
mga
suffrage,
women.
for example. and for women, for example. So in that sense, the civil empowerment talks about your right to control government or to limit government. Because, for example, in the Philippines, there is a symbolic there's a symbolism why the head of the military, for example, is the president, who is a civil servant elected by ordinary citizens, because the supremacy of the people is the supremacy or the supremacy of the people's will should dito should always emanate. So in that case, civil empowerment is seen when we are able to check and balance ourselves the actions of our government.
Ayun.
So,
So
yeah.
ito pala yung ano, bali, ito nag-evolve. Sabi mo, unang-una kasi pinaka-basic yung safety, yung survival. The matter of survival of the individual and protection from harm. And then, unti-unti, nag-evolve dun sa iba-ibang right, kaugnay sa kanilang ika nga boses sa mga desisyon ng gobyerno. And then, nabanggit mo rin later on yung mga economic and social rights ng mga tao.
That's the second generation na.
Ayan.
Because when people were granted the right to participate in public affairs and to dictate policies through their representatives, then the second generation of human rights talks about yung mga promotion of the welfare of their well-being. So diyan papasok yung economic and social and cultural rights. So yan yung tinatawag na equality, no? Kung saan diyan papasok yung yung a fair day's wage for a fair day's work.
Yes.
Diba? So bakit ka babaya? So diyan pumasok, for example, in the Philippines, the importance of minimum wage. So the importance of humane conditions of work. So all rights and protections involving or relative to work and production, dyan papasok yan.
Ayun.
Sa second generation of human rights.
So, nabanggit mo na yung ibang examples. Can you give us other examples ng mga violations ng human rights? Nabanggit mo nga kanina, pwede kang patayin bigla, pwede kang ikulong. Ito naman, hindi bayaran ng appropriate wages. Ano pang mga examples ng violation ng human rights?
Well, ayan, yung extrajudicial killings, yung arbitrary detention, those are kinds of human rights violations that's common or that can easily be determined, no? So slavery, for example, and forced labor is one of those examples as well.
So, lahat ba nung ito, nababalita natin lagi ito, yung extrajudicial killings as violation of human rights. Do all cases of extrajudicial killings fall into the category ng violation ng human rights?
Extrajudicial killings itself, no, as a concept, covers those that are sanctioned by government and those that are not. Because extrajudicial killing, at its purest sense, only means that you have arbitrarily deprived another person's life.
Yes.
So, technically speaking, pwede mong ma-argue that extrajudicial killing ang homicide or murder. But, in the context of human rights violations, we are only focused on those that are sanctioned by government. Because supposedly, it's the government that is promoting and protecting your right to due process, your right to be heard and to be given your day in trial. So when it is seen or when it is observed that it is the state who is lacking, who is either promoting these killings or who is being negligent in preventing these killings, then that would qualify it in its legal sense a human rights violation.
So, yan ba yung sinasabing concept ng state responsibility in international law? Can you tell us more about this?
When you're talking about state responsibility, then you're talking about the idea of parents patriae, no? Na kung saan supposedly, yan din, I think you discussed this when we were talking about this a child.
Oh, yes.
But the concept ultimately is hanggang saan ba ang hanggang saan ba ang obligations ng isang gobyerno in promoting these human rights. So state responsibility as a legal sense is often looked at if there is a violation.
Mhm.
So kaya nga dyan papasok yung mga observation, nagpapadala ang international community na mga mag-observe, and then they're nag-i-investigate into the killings. So they want to assess what is the degree of participation and the nature of participation of a government in order to determine if this is really a state obligation in the first place. So dyan papasok yung it's a tricky thing really kasi nga as we can see, hindi naman ganun kadaling i-determine if it's really a state action or not. But again, there are indicia or there are signs that would tell you, no, that would help individuals to know if this is really state sanctioned. When, for example, a leader openly promotes shooting individuals, then that in itself is a red flag.
Yes. I think the next question is what happens when the state fails to meet these responsibilities, and how are states made to be held accountable for this failure to meet these responsibilities?
If you're looking at it from the international perspective, then dyan papasok yung concept dyan papasok ang International Criminal Court, na kung saan leaders who if for example they committed any of these crimes, kasi there are only 4 international crimes as punished in the ICC: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. So if any of this is seen as a violation of a state leader, then individually the heads of states are prosecuted, and they of course will be imprisoned somewhere. No?
So
But
that seems to be what some leaders are saying now about alleged atrocities in Ukraine, and trying to attribute this to the orders of the leader of Russia.
actually that's also what do you call this? That is a subject of discussion, a different discussion. But we would obviously see that if this is the case, then there's also other remedies of a country. That's why pwede ka rin magkaroon ng suits between two nations. So, dyan papasok ulit yung, parang isipin nyo na lang siya na the enforcement mechanism really is like parang mga tao din.
Yeah.
But in the concept of state to state.
Ayun. So, there you have it mga katribo. I hope nalinawan tayo at matanda natin yung mga paliwanag sa atin ni Attorney Alfred. So, wag po muna kayong aalis. Magbabalik muli ang Legal Diaries.
Ang Daily Tribune may digital shows na din. Dahil sa mas lumalaki at mas lumalakas nating tribu, handog sa inyo ng Daily Tribune ang mga programang magbibigay buhay araw-araw. Be informed at mag-good vibes tuwing umaga sa programang Gising Na. Be updated sa news and happenings sa Tribune News on Cue. Mas kilalanin pa natin ang mga paborito nyong atleta sa programang The Athletes Tribune. Alamin ang latest entertainment sa programang What's Up. Ma-inspire sa mga kwentong hatid ng Perfect. Search lang ang Daily Tribune sa inyong Facebook at Tribune Now on YouTube. See you there mga katribu! Alamin ang latest entertainment at sa mga paborito nyong celebrities kasama si Pocholo Concepcion sa programang What's Up. Makibanding at kwentuhan kasama ang mga kilalang personalidad sa entertainment industry. Sama-sama natin silang kilalanin at silipin ang makulay nilang mundo every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Kaya sit back and relax lang kayo mga katribu. Hanapin at ilike ang Daily Tribune Facebook page at Tribune Now on YouTube. Dahil sagot na namin ang masayang kwentuhan dito lang sa What's Up.
Muling nagbabalik ang Kalingang KaTribu Legal Diaries. We're still with Attorney Alfred here, and for this segment, we have a trivia to provide you. what you call tribunal. In the Philippines, the Commission on Human Rights primarily handles the investigation of human rights violations. However, it has no power to resolve issues as stated in the Supreme Court decision issued in 1991. Any comment about this, attorney?
The Commission on Human Rights does not have any quasi-judicial powers. So, because when it comes to what do you call this? When it comes to actual controversies, then you have the judiciary to do so. If you think that there are possible, if there are possible atrocities being forwarded by your state, then you have your remedies to go to the Supreme Court or to file the necessary actions in our local machineries. But the principle of complementarity would always apply. That even if the state fails to, remember in the Philippines, if you sue the state, they have to consent to it. But in the concept of human rights, if there is already extreme violations, then complementarity applies. And then in that sense, even if the state refuses to participate in the proceedings internationally, they can still be tried and held accountable for any human rights violations.
Again, thank you very much for joining us today and providing us these explanations and your discussions about this very important topic. Thank you, Attorney Alfred.
Thank you as well for having me.
Ayan. And thank you mga katribo for joining another informative episode of Kalingang KaTribu Legal Diaries. You can watch us live on Daily Tribune's official Facebook page every Fridays at 3:30 in the afternoon and on Tribune Now on YouTube. Muli, ako po si Roy Pelovello. Magandang hapon and happy weekend.